Following the Meiji Restoration in 1868, the nation embarked upon fulfilling her compelling ambition to attain genuine advanced statehood, unrivaled globally, thereby ensuring national sovereignty. Two period slogans demonstrate the country's motivations: national prosperity and military strength, civilization and enlightenment. The primary objectives implicit in the latter slogan necessarily originated from the former. Wealth and armed capability served as the dual foundations. It naturally followed that national defense would inevitably dominate domestic governance. As a consequence of her triumphs in the conflicts against China, 1894–95, and Tsarist Russia, 1904–05, the nation secured the fundamental elements of her national aspirations temporarily. Subsequently, she undertook the administration of Manchuria. This represented the initial step in the nation's policy of developing the Asian continent and pursuing territorial expansion. Through their success, the major developments in national policies significantly enhanced the already dominant role of national defense in governance. Distinctive to the armed forces generally was the complete autonomy of authority inherent in the supreme command function. This fundamental characteristic solidly underpinned the predominance of national defense in the country's governance. The independence of the military's command prerogatives led to an actual separation of domestic political considerations from the function of national defense. Thus did the military gain an overwhelming ascendancy and a springboard for their own developing political interests. The so-called political power of the army in recent times stemmed from the independence of the supreme command prerogative as prescribed in the Meiji Constitution. In establishing national policy, the nation of the Meiji era possessed no strategic war plans involving a potential enemy. Concepts of national defense were, in fact, so vague that the country merely intended to undertake defensive operations on her own territory in the event of an enemy invasion. After the conclusion of the Anglo-Japanese alliance, the nation commenced to regard Russia as the potential foe. The navy of the time, however, was still so small and weak that the old national defensive policy remained unchanged. After the termination of the Russo-Japanese War, Field Marshal Yamagata approached the emperor in 1906 concerning the necessity of preparing a basic national defense policy. The following year, the Army and the Navy established the first national defense policy and specific programming. The Prime Minister was shown the basic documents, after which they were submitted to the Emperor for his sanction. The main objective of the national defensive policy centered upon the postulation of a potential enemy. In the first plans of 1907, the primary foe was judged to be Tsarist Russia, which, it was presumed in Tokyo, would be seeking revenge for the reverse of 1904–05. The years which followed the establishment of a new national defense policy witnessed remarkable changes in the international scene surrounding the nation: the ruin of the Tsarist Russian Empire, the birth of the Soviet Union, the powerful increase of American influence in the Far East, and the exclusion movement within the United States itself. As a consequence, the order of hypothetical enemies was rearranged in 1918, whereby America assumed primary emphasis, followed by the USSR and China in that order. After the Washington Conference, the imperial defense policy underwent minor revisions in 1923. By the time that the next slight alterations were effected in 1936, the Manchurian incident had already broken out. In normal times, the General Staff customarily drew up annual operational plans and submitted them to the Emperor for his sanction. Upon the outbreak of hostilities, the army could be expected to launch operations based upon the fundamental principles laid down in the annual plan then in effect. The basic operational policy of the army had, in normal times, remained defensive prior to the Russo-Japanese War, but was thereafter converted to an offensive type. The transition is attributable to the annihilation of Tsarist Russian naval power in Far Eastern waters and to the acquisition by the nation of footholds on the Asian mainland. Both factors rendered offensive operations far more feasible than had been the case during the Russo-Japanese conflict. The nation's basic policy embodying offensive operations was still in effect when the Pacific War commenced. After the First World War, the Army General Staff had speculated that the nature of future wars would be long and drawn out. The sum total of the national power potential appeared, however, to render the prospects for a protracted war difficult, if not impossible, for the nation. It followed that the country would therefore have to plan for a short war, which laid stress upon the opening moves and operational execution. To take the enemy by surprise, by initiating hostilities without prior declaration of war, to provoke early battle, and to achieve an immediate decision, these were the fundamental objectives which were woven into the Army's regular operational plans, centering upon offensive action. No change in the operational fundamentals took place before. The national policies put into effect after the Russo-Japanese War fixed the nation's course on the Asian continent for the decades to follow. At the time that it was fought, the war with Tsarist Russia had been considered an all-out national conflict, but in retrospect this was not necessarily true, especially within the modern conception of total war. The nation nevertheless remained undeniably complacent, resting upon her laurels. She neglected to take a new and hard look at national policy or at the scope of the long-established operational plans within the framework of all-out warfare. The army dogmatically spoke of total war centering about itself, with the rest of the country inevitably following its lead. This was nothing less than a complacent delusion born of incomplete comprehension of modern war's nature. The army's dogma ran counter to developing world trends. War was tending to become ever more comprehensive, while at the same time the international balance of power was undergoing changes. Despite these factors, the nation's policy of exclusively offensive strategic operations remained inflexible. It was felt even more strongly than ever that Manchuria was bound to be the hypothetical field of battle for the army, as well as the front line of national defense. In view of this emphasis, a demand for new policies toward the three northeastern provinces of China, i.e. Manchuria, was discussed about in army circles. After the fall of Tsarist Russia and the removal of that threat, public opinion sought a reduction of the armed forces for budgetary reasons. Essentially, to counteract this domestic pressure, the Army General Staff drafted new operational plans against Russia. Only in 1928 or 1929, however, did the Army really begin to devote serious attention to the Soviet Union as the major hypothetical ground foe. The first Soviet five-year plan, launched in 1928, indicated that the USSR was not only intent upon building up its total national defensive capability, but was also determined to develop the economic resources of the Soviet Far East. In addition, the fierce Soviet army offensive against Manchuria in 1929, which gave evidence of exceptional execution and tactical skill, greatly impressed the army. It now appeared inevitable that the nation must soon take into account the Soviet Union's growing strength. A recrudescence of Russian power in the East would seriously endanger the nation's policies on the continent of Asia. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, the general feeling was that the rights and interests won in Manchuria at the price of army bloodshed there during the Russo-Japanese War must not be thrown away. Nevertheless, the Chinese nationalist government led an anti-national movement which grew increasingly violent after 1928 or 1929. Between the two countries, more than 300 unresolved disputes remained pending. The Chinese persecuted the national residents and the Korean residents, the latter being national subjects, while they constantly whittled away at national rights and interests in Manchuria. Daily, the situation grew more serious, and only two ways out seemed possible: to evacuate every last national from Manchuria, or to make China give up the so-called policy of recapturing her national rights. Kwantung Army Headquarters, in particular, clamored for the second solution. To buttress the nation's defensive position vis the Soviet menace, it was extremely desirable that Manchuria be stabilized, a development which was closely tied up with the possibilities of stabilizing China itself. At the time, the nation was suffering from high tariff walls and from the exclusion of her people who might want to migrate abroad. Under the circumstances, a stabilized Manchuria was important as a market for her products and as a place where her emigrants might settle. These notions were fast spreading among army circles, especially among key officers mostly of field grade, with staff assignments. The situation was desperate, and some of the staff officers at Kwantung Army Headquarters secretly laid plans to solve the Manchurian problem satisfactorily and rapidly by resorting to arms. On September 18, 1931, the Lutiauku incident broke out near Mukden. At the time, Kwantung Army Headquarters was located at Port Arthur, and the garrison troops consisted primarily of 1 infantry division and 6 battalions of the Independent Garrison Unit with headquarters at Mukden. Existing treaties provided for no more than 17 railway guards per kilometre, and the total strength of the Kwantung Army amounted to only about 10,400 troops. On September 19th, the day after the affair at Lutiauku, the government, which had decided upon a policy of localizing the incident, communicated its decision to the Kwantung Army authorities. Despite this, the Kwantung Army rapidly proceeded to expand its operations and, within the next 5 months, had seized most of the principal cities and towns throughout all Manchuria. From the Kwantung Army's arbitrary decision and execution of the Manchurian incident dates the nickname of Kwantung Army, applied in army circles to any expeditionary force which ignored the Supreme Command's dictates. The fact that such a nickname could now be heard in public gave evidence of the great transformations that were overtaking the army. The first great change which took place within the army was its emergence into the political arena in the period from about the time of the outbreak of the Manchurian incident to the 226 incident of 1936. During these years, a series of incidents broke out in succession, fomented by army officers and men, e.g., the March incident, the Imperial Colours incident, the 515 incident, the Military Academy incident, and the Aizawa incident. It is well known that the army, impelled by these incidents, began to intervene in the very heart of national politics. A basic cause of the army's developing political activity was the internal situation, or, more specifically, the case of the impoverished rural communities. The latter were extremely important to the army as its primary source of military manpower. Most of the officer corps derived from small or middle-class landowner antecedents or from landed farm families. The majority of the non-commissioned officers and enlisted men came from rural communities. Poverty in agricultural districts served as an effective incitement for the army, especially the younger officers, to turn to radical political movements of reform. Still, another political influence arose from abroad from Germany. Since the early days of the modern armed forces, Germany had served as a model for army officers and had been intensely respected by them. In the 1930s, the brilliant ascendancy of Nazi Germany and its advanced armaments made an even deeper impression upon the admiring army. The dominant opinion in army circles therefore stressed that the nation ought to follow Germany's lead in order to effect a state of readiness swiftly. The German influence cannot be underrated as a cause of the army's intervention in domestic politics. Factionalism among army cliques also entered into the picture. One faction was called the Kodoha Imperial Benevolent Rule, clique under generals like Araki, Masaki, Yanagawa, and Obata. The second group, the Toseiha Control Clique, was led by Generals Sugiyama, Koiso, Umezu, Nagata, and Tojo. After the Manchurian incident, these two cliques struggled mightily against each other. The Kodo group believed that the so-called Showa restoration, comparable to Meiji restoration, could only be effected by means of riots and the call-out of troops. The fundamental principle which they respected was the role of the emperor as an absolute being. In the Kodo view, the political scene could be cleaned up if only the villainous court retainers were eliminated. Figuratively speaking, after the clouds were gone, the sun could once again shine down. The Tosei group, on the other hand, opposed radical political movements like those of the Kodo clique and insisted upon controlled military action. Fundamental to both factions, however, was the common belief that national defense must be strengthened through the reform of national politics. The previously mentioned 226 incident of 1936 was caused by young officers influenced by the Kodo Ha. Taking advantage of the insurrection to crack down upon the Kodo faction, the Toseiha proceeded to purge the army. They prohibited army intervention in domestic politics, except through the agency of the Minister of War. Thereafter, cliquish factionalism began to abate, but the Tosei's purge failed completely in its basic purpose to avert army interference in the political scene. After the purge, in fact, the army entered legitimately into political organizations and thereby finally established a tremendous voice in domestic politics. On one hand, the army was allied with officialdom and the elder statesmen. On the other, it could deal with the worlds of industry and of politics. Military intervention in politics, and the resultant factional clashes of ideology, led to a second great transformation within the army. The growing vogue of insubordination by lower-ranking officers, especially lieutenants, captains, and majors against their superiors. The so-called young officers, confident and conceited because of their very youth and alleged powers of execution, sometimes reproached the prudence of older officers. Not a few of the radicals committed outrages or upset military discipline. The military authorities, nevertheless, remained absorbed only with the doling out of appropriate rewards, while neglecting to mete out commensurate punishments. Certain key officers who most deserved severe punishment were mildly reproved or transferred to other posts, after which they were able to regain important assignments. Among the high-ranking officers themselves, there were many who lacked the judgment and ability necessary to guide the key officers and the troops. The worst of the superiors tried to curry favor among the younger officers by demonstrating allegedly radical views. Many of the previously cited factional quarrels between cliques may have sprung from this whole atmosphere. Apart from the extreme examples, however, there were only too many general officers who believed in the broad-minded and celebrated attitude of appearing to swallow blindly whatever the young officers had to say. This trend swept the army, with the result that it became impossible for a high-ranking officer to give a categorical yes or no. He was more apt to give in to the opinions of subordinates. Whether or not this was all cause or effect, the tendency toward insubordination became ever more conspicuous within the army. For example, headquarters, staff officers, whose essential function is to labor in the background, pushed forward into domestic politics. Some of them actually acted as if they were themselves prime ministers or high commanders. This state of affairs often led to the hushing up of culpability or responsibility. The army wielded great power over outside circles in the name of the monolithic military will, but the underlying facts were quite different, as we have seen. One cannot say that the whole army was either under strict control or evinced a clear singleness of purpose. Areas of responsibility were exceedingly ill-defined. Statements by a key officer or a field general often exerted great and undue influence upon the public, although utterly unrelated to the true will of the war minister or of the chief of staff. Political, economic, and social circles seemed to have scant grasp of the true state of affairs within the army. This was unavoidable, for how could outsiders get behind the protective shield which the army often threw up before itself, e.g., the independence of the supreme command prerogative? At any rate, the gloomy and all-pervasive transformations which occurred within the army in the 1930s were an indisputably major factor which contributed tremendously to the eventual catastrophe. As we have already observed, defense policy underwent certain changes in keeping with the priorities assigned to potential enemies. Especially after the Manchurian incident, it became imperative to establish a clearly fixed basis for deciding upon the relative emphasis to be allocated the Army and the Navy within the defense budget. We cannot ascertain, however, whether a definitive policy decision was ever really made concerning the priorities to be assigned to the armed services. We do know, though, that after the Manchurian incident, the Army and the Navy fought tooth and nail in order to secure as much of the fluctuating military budget as possible. The struggle was no less fierce where the allocation of natural resources was concerned. The army concentrated upon strengthening the defenses of Manchukuo, with a view toward the Soviet Union as the hypothetical primary enemy. The Navy, on the other hand, designed its program of construction against what it considered to be the potential fifth U.S. Navy. As the international situation grew more critical, inter-service rivalries intensified. Eventually, reconciliation of interests proved impossible, and each of the armed services went its own way. In the event of a war with the Soviet Union, military operations had originally been predicated upon a struggle for vital North Manchuria in two major sectors: the plains region between Harbin and the upper Sungari River, which flows between Helsinki and Harbin, and the flatlands between Taunan and Sitsihar. In the early summer of 1938, however, the Soviet army began to erect pillbox positions along the frontiers, opposite the border forts which the Kwantung army then proceeded to build. Under the circumstances, operational planning was revised in 1934, whereby the opening rounds of a hypothetical war with the USSR were contemplated in the neighborhood of the Manchurian frontiers. By 1934, Soviet super-heavy bomber aircraft, reportedly capable of striking the home islands, were deployed in the maritime province of Siberia. In view of this situation, the General Staff effected radical changes in its operational planning for the eventuality of hostilities with the Soviet Union. 1. From a mobilizable force of 30 fully equipped ground divisions, some 24 were earmarked for commitment to operations against the USSR. 2. Great importance was to be attached to air operations from the very outset of war. 3. The nation should seek to wage battle on Soviet soil from the beginning of hostilities. 4. The primary axis of offensive operations should be eastward from Manchuria. 5. Submarine bases and bomber aircraft sites aimed at the nation must be wiped out at the beginning. 6. After the success of the eastward operations, forces should be deployed for an offensive northward, the objective being the Lake Baikal district. It should be noted that the idea of launching an eastern offensive was first conceived at the time of this new plan of 1934. 3 years later, operational planning was again revised. 1. At the very commencement of a war, the forces stationed in Manchuria will mount an offensive against the Soviet Union. Reinforcements thereafter dispatched from the homeland will join in the attack. This plan differed from its predecessor, which had called for an offensive only after the reinforcements had arrived in Manchuria. 2. After successfully concluding the eastern offensive, forces should not immediately drive toward the Lake Baikal region, but should instead consolidate along the Shingan mountain range and prepare for subsequent operations. 3. Operational planning against the USSR must attach prime importance to action against both China and Soviet Russia. In devising operational plans against the USSR, the hypothetical movements of the Soviet Far Eastern Army were a major consideration. The Army General Staff made the following estimate of the situation. The Soviets could be expected to commit 55 to 60 divisions for the Far Eastern operations. They would launch simultaneous, converging offensives from the east, north, and west of Manchuria. The enemy would strive to cut off communications between the homeland and the Asian continent. If war broke out with the Soviet Union, a most important problem would arise: how to terminate hostilities. The General Staff feared that Russian territory was so boundless that the nation would be unable to deal a finishing blow to the enemy. Within the army, the prevailing and popular opinion concerning the solution to this problem was to employ stratagem subversion simultaneously with military operations. Colonel Akashi had so successfully done during the Russo War. The army therefore placed as much importance upon political sabotage as it did upon field operations in planning for hypothetical operations against the Soviet Union. Researches were pursued and preparations laid for implementing certain aspects of the overall program. In 1931, there were 17 divisions. After the outbreak of the Manchurian incident, the army reinforced and consolidated its troop strength in Manchuria. Even in peacetime, the army had to contemplate hypothetical operations against China as well as the Soviet Union. For a long time, no major changes had been made in the fundamental operational planning, which called for the seizure and occupation of various strategic points in China by a few divisions or independent brigades. Plans drawn up before the China incident, for example, envisaged the following operations. North China, occupation of Tientsin and Peiping by 2 or 3 divisions. Central China, occupation of Shanghai and environs by 1 or 2 divisions. South China, occupation of Amoy, Fuzhou, and Swatow by about 1 division. This was the gist, then, of hypothetical military operations against China, but the General Staff expected no actual war with that country. In fact, the General Staff issued orders in 1936 to its China Garrison Army, headquarters in Tientsin, that the officers and men should be instructed how to fight the Soviet-Russian army and should be disciplined for such a mission. These orders concerning anti-Soviet training never envisaged a combat application against the Chinese army, in the thinking of then Major General Kanji Ishihara, Chief of the 1st Operations, Bureau of the General Staff. After withdrawing from the League of Nations March 1933, the nation had sought to implement her national policy of promoting the growth and strength of Manchukuo. The Kwantung Army and the China Garrison Forces complied with this policy by establishing a neutral zone throughout Mongolia and North China. These actions were taken in order to cut off the political machinations which emanated from and were directed by China, and which were intended to upset peace and order within Manchukuo. On the other hand, the ardent desire of the Chinese to recapture Manchuria was welling up into a surge of anti-sentiment. In November 1936 occurred the Suiyuan incident, when a Chinese army under General Fu Tsui defeated the Kwantung Army's own Inner Mongolia army. This event instilled in the Chinese a confidence in their ability to resist successfully. The Xi'an incident of December 1936 led to cooperation between the Kuomintang nationalists and the communists, who had long been feuding with each other. All of China was now turning anti-national. Under these circumstances, the Lukuchao Marco Polo Bridge incident broke out on July 7, 1937. The causes of the incident have not been exhaustively investigated to this very day, but suspicions have not been dispelled that the whole thing was a ruse devised and executed on their own by a few willful men, rather than by the authorities of either the nation or China. As soon as the Lukuchao incident erupted, the government decided upon a policy of localization to settle matters on the spot. Under orders from the government, the local authorities therefore sought to iron things out. They just missed succeeding. Primary reasons for the eventual failure of all efforts to localize the incident may be summarized as follows. The policy of localization lacked consistency. On the side, there were tough groups within the government, the army, and the China garrison forces which decidedly felt that the nation ought to avail herself of the opportunity to smash China at once. The dispatch of reinforcements, 3 divisions to North China, close on the heels of troop mobilization, led the Chinese to suspect that the nation was playing for time by parleying with them while simultaneously completing preparations for launching war. Taking advantage of the incident, the Kwantung Army was eager to throw troops into North China in order to deal a decisive blow to the political power of Chiang Kai-shek and thereby eradicate the disturbances to Manchukuoan tranquility. Soon after Lieutenant General Kiyoshi Katsuki took over the command of the China Garrison Army headquarters at Tientsin, he aligned himself with the elements which supported a tough policy versus China. General Katsuki replaced Lieutenant General Kanichiro Tashiro, an authority on China, who had died of illness in July. After the Lukuchao incident, anti-national feeling was greatly stimulated among the army and the people of China. The Langfang and Kwangmen incidents exhausted the garrison army's patience and prudence toward China. The Army High Command, upon receipt of information from the China Garrison Army, issued orders for the chastisement of the Chinese army, with one restriction, that after launching their operations, the forces should not advance beyond the Yungting, a river which flows west and south of Peiping, in the direction of Tientsin. This stipulation clearly indicated the contemporary Army General Staff's intention to fix limits in the application of military force and to adhere to the policy of localization, insofar as possible. On August 13, 1937, the fighting spread to the Shanghai area, but even then the General Staff clung to the principle of localization in settling affairs in China. On November 17, Imperial General Headquarters, IGHQ, was established. To expedite a termination of the China incident, as the fighting was termed after September 2, IGHQ determined to promote cooperation between the Army and the Navy, and to select Nanking, the Chinese nationalist capital, as the final objective of military operations. Underlying the decision was an estimate that it was entirely reasonable to suppose that nationalist China might abandon its anti-struggle after the fall of Nanking. After hard fighting, troops completed the capture of Nanking on December 13, 1937. The loss of the city jarred the nationalist Chinese government but did not deal it a death blow. At about this time, the German ambassador to China, Oskar Trautmann, undertook to mediate between the nation and China upon the following terms. 1. Give autonomy to Inner Mongolia. 2. Enlarge the garrison zones of troops in North China. 3. Allow no anti-individuals to be appointed to administrative posts in North China. 4. Enlarge the demilitarized zone in Shanghai. 5. Root out anti-policies. 6. Adhere to the Anti-Comintern Pact. 7. Take steps to improve tariff relationships. 8. China should respect foreign countries' rights and interests in her territory. The attempts at mediation ended in failure. Looking back upon the events, an official who held a responsible governmental post at the time has observed that the failure was attributable to China's ignoring of the anticipated mediation. To the causes of failure, however, we must add that on the side, there was a basic disagreement between foreign policy and military policy. The field armies, without knowledge of the mediation efforts then in progress, never slackened their hot pursuit of the Chinese army in the drive to capture Nanking. Under the circumstances, there was no room for mediation. Soon the forces were fighting on the Shantung Peninsula, where they captured Chinan and Tsingtao in succession. Until this time, IGHQ had been pursuing a dual policy. It had continued to reserve its main strength, over 20 divisions, against the eventuality of operations against the USSR. While exerting this restraint upon the Soviet army, the forces were simultaneously waging the campaign against China, with the balance of their forces. The reason for this twofold policy lay in the fact that, within military circles, the opinion prevailed that a severe blow could be dealt the Chinese army within a short period, say, 1 year. IGHQ, however, had experience with the fierce counterattacks of the Chinese army at Taichuang in Shantung province. The High Command could not therefore avoid committing part of the troop strength previously reserved for anti-Soviet operations with the start of the Suchow operation. Suchow itself was captured on May 19, 1938. From this very period dates IHQ's abandonment of the policy of localization of the China incident. Between the policies of the High Command and of the field units there had been inherent contradiction. If the basic policy were to be localization, but the actual power to resolve matters was in effect left to the forces on the spot, then a successful solution could hardly be expected. It was, after all, characteristic of the army that on-the-spot commanders always exerted a more powerful local influence than did the High Command itself. From this point of view, in fact, IGHQ seems to have been lacking in resolute will. After the success of the Suchow operation, followed by the Canton and Wuhan campaigns, in the latter of which Wuchang, Hanyang and Hankow were captured, the army held up its offensives for a while. Although the troop strength of the Chinese army appeared to have dwindled to about 900,000, they continued their obstinate resistance. The Chinese took the best possible advantage of their vast and boundless terrain. They preserved their own fighting strength while wearing down the troops with frequent shifts of force and fluid tactics of advance or retreat, depending upon the situation. Because of the Fabian tactics of the Chinese, most of the annihilation operations of the army ended in failure. Only narrow belts of territory could be captured. The prompt settlement of the China incident by force, as originally envisaged by the army, thus failed in the long run. The strength committed was too small, for one thing. By and large, however, the nation's failure is attributable to the army's hasty judgment that the Chinese military forces could be crushed in a single blow. They underestimated the national consciousness of the Chinese people and had no clear realization of the fact that the China incident was characterized by racial warfare. Just before Prime Minister Konoye issued a statement on January 16, 1938, to the effect that the nation would have nothing further to do with the nationalist regime, the High Command had advised the government that such action was premature. The army was still setting its hopes upon an early settlement of the China incident. After Konoye's statement, the army initiated secret overtures toward Wang Qingwei. The objective of these feelers was to drag the nationalist government into making peace with the nation by splitting and collapsing the various resistance groups. The army dreamed that this scheme could be accomplished if Wang Qingwei could obtain massive support within Chinese governmental quarters, after which he could gather these groups under his wing and clamor for peace. The army advised the government of its continuing efforts to cooperate with Wang Qingwei. The government endorsed the army's report, and on November 8, 1938, Premier Konoye declared on behalf of the government that the nation would not refuse nationalist China's participation in the establishment of a new order in East Asia if the Chinese government were reconstructed. This statement was highly significant through its indication that a combination of politics and force was going to replace the former method of naked military power alone in settling the China incident. One after another, however, the United States, Great Britain and France avowed their intention of opposing the establishment of a new order. After fleeing from Chongqing, where he was considered a traitor to his country, Wang Qingwei lost the ability to effect a peaceful settlement of the China incident. The nation therefore acceded to his desire by assisting him to establish a new nationalist government, of which he was to be the head. The peace plan which the nation had intended to realize by making use of Wang Qingwei had ended in failure. At about the same time, the general headquarters of the China Expeditionary Army was established in Nanking on October 1, 1939, under the command of General Nishio. In January 1940, this GHQ undertook secret peace overtures toward the Chongqing government. Especially great efforts were made to reach an understanding before Wang Qingwei's regime moved to the capital at Nanking, scheduled for March 26, 1940. The peace conditions called for the 1. Recognition of Manchukuo, 2. Abandonment of anti-policies, 3. Participation in anti-communist operations, which would require a portion of the army to be stationed in China, 4. Abolition of extraterritoriality, 5. Return of the foreign concessions, 6. Settlement of the problem of the Wang Qingwei regime, 7. Evacuation of troops from China. The greatest stumbling block to mediation between the nation and China lay in the question of recognizing Manchukuo. The nation demanded that China bestow formal recognition upon Manchukuo, while Chongqing insisted strongly upon only tacit acquiescence. Neither side retreated in the least from its strongly held position. GHQ of the China Expeditionary Army did its utmost to reach agreement with Chongqing, even going so far as to put off the formal installation of the Wang Qingwei government in the capital of Nanking from the previously scheduled 26th of March to the 30th. The overtures failed, although negotiations dragged on for a while until September, when the Tripartite Alliance was signed between the nation, Germany, and Italy. IGHQ took this opportunity to break off the peace parleys. Chongqing's distrust was the greatest cause of failure for the peace overtures made to the nationalists. The Chinese felt strongly that they could place no faith in a so-called peace which was far from genuine but represented only a temporary ceasefire. Nor could the nationalists bring themselves to believe that the nation had abandoned a policy of invasion as the real intention. This underlying distrust was deeply rooted in the nationalist government and dominated it from beginning to end of the China incident. Even Wang Qingwei perceived, from the peace overtures to Chongqing, that the nation could not be trusted. After the establishment of the Wang Qingwei regime, feelings of distrust toward the nation ran high in Nanking. Force had failed to settle the China incident, nor had the subsequent policy of combining politics and military power achieved more than a deadlock. Now the army stressed operations designed to cut off routes of aid to Chiang Kai-shek. The first step in these operations was the Nanning Offensive, which commenced in November 1939. After the Nanning Drive, IGHQ began to watch for the chance to close off aid to Chiang channels leading through French Indochina, Hong Kong, and Burma. These considerations were affected by developments in the European War. In pursuit of operational objectives stemming therefrom, the nation advanced into South China and French Indochina. While troops were fighting on many battlefields throughout China, two large-scale incidents broke out along the frontiers of Manchuria that would significantly influence military thinking and planning. During the Changkufeng incident, 1938, the 19th Division took on at least two Soviet infantry divisions in a territorial dispute between the nation and Manchukuo on the one hand and the USSR on the other. The Nomonhan incident, 1939, arose from border problems involving the nation Manchukuo and the Soviet Union Outer Mongolia. In April 1939, the Kwantung Army laid down regulations to guide frontline units in dealing with frontier troubles. The principles for the settlement of Soviet-Manchurian border disputes stipulated: 1. The basic policy is never to invade and never to be invaded. 2. If an enemy violates the frontiers, he must be wiped out at once. 3. Where the borders are not precisely defined, the Area Defense Commander will assume responsibility for demarcation and will so advise the frontline units in order to avoid disputes and to facilitate troop movements. 4. An intolerable dilemma confronts border garrison units. They are considered cowardly if they are overly prudent in their actions, but will be called to task if they act too boldly or aggressively. In view of these apprehensions, it will hereafter be regarded as the responsibility of higher headquarters to deal with the consequences of situations which may arise from the positive actions of forward elements. In the Nomonhan region of West Manchuria, the National and the Manchukuan forces contended that the borderline ran along the Halha River, known to the Russians as the Khalkhin Gol, which flows into Lake Buyur-Nor. The Soviets and the Outer Mongolians insisted, however, that the frontier lay about 30 kilometers east of Nomonhan. On May 12, 1939, some 700 Outer Mongol horsemen crossed the Halha River. The Kwantung Army considered this action to be a violation of the Manchukuoan frontier and repelled the raiders in conformity with the current Border Defense Guide regulations mentioned above. The Outer Mongolians, however, received reinforcements, recrossed the river, and attacked again. In the course of successive engagements, both sides gradually built up their forces, the Russians and the Outer Mongolians versus the Nationals and the Manchukuoans. By the middle of August, greatly reinforced strengths confronted each other. Kwantung Army forces were built around Lieutenant General Michitaro Komatsubara's 23rd Division, whose headquarters had been at Halar, over 100 miles from the site of the fighting. The Soviets had 3 infantry divisions and 5 mechanized brigades, 480 tanks and the same number of armored cars, while the Outer Mongolians possessed 2 cavalry divisions. Before the arrival of Kwantung Army reinforcements, the Soviet Army launched an offensive on August 20th and inflicted severe losses upon the forces. The Russians employed encircling tactics and made skillful use of their superior artillery and armor. Of the 15,140 men in the Komatsubara force, of which the 23rd Division was the core, 11,124 were killed or wounded in action. During the period between July 1st and September 16th, which covers most of the fighting at Nomonhan, casualties totaled no less than 78% as a percentage of the force engaged. Most of these losses were incurred during the Soviets' August offensive. By way of comparison, the percentage of casualties suffered during the bloody fighting in the major battles of the Russo-Japanese War in 1904–05 had approximated: in 5 days of fighting at Liaoyang, 17%; in 7 days of fighting at the Shaho, 17%; in 13 days of fighting at Mukden, 28%. Still awaiting the arrival of reinforcements, the Kwantung Army girded for a counter-offensive, but on September 15th an armistice was arranged in Moscow. The troops stopped fighting next day. Among military authorities, the most widespread opinion was that the Nomonhan incident had been a maneuver instigated by the Soviet Union in order to restrain the army from disposing of the China incident. After the negotiation of the Nomonhan armistice, the newly appointed commanding general of the Kwantung Army, Yoshijiro Umezu, took immediate steps to prevent further border troubles. He pulled back troops somewhat behind the frontiers where demarcation lines were not precise. A fundamental principle designed to prevent border incidents was General Umezu's order that in the event of Soviet or Outer Mongolian penetration of a disputed area, only the commander of the Kwantung Army himself could decide whether troops might counterattack. The new measures represented a fundamental revision of the old border defense principles. Bold and positive frontline attacks against the enemy, which had been formally stressed, were not to be sanctioned now. As a result, a more peaceful atmosphere thereafter prevailed in the vicinity of the frontiers. The Nomonhan incident gave the army an opportunity to realize the actual ability of the Soviet army. Seeing was believing. 1. The bulk of the Soviet ground forces' artillery and armor were far superior to the army in terms of firepower and mechanized equipment. 2. The forces were exceedingly surprised by Soviet capability of transporting and storing war material at a battlefront 600 kilometers away from a railroad terminal. 3. Having rid itself of the inflexibility which characterized the old Tsarist forces, the Soviet army proved able to change tactics from battle to battle. At the beginning of the incident, for example, most of the Soviet tanks were ignited by gasoline bottles hurled at them by troops. A month later, however, the Russians were using crude oil fuel or were covering the tank chassis with wire nets. Other cases of Soviet field improvisation were numerous. 4. The Soviet army was more tenacious than had been expected. After the end of the Nomonhan fighting, the Army High Command set up a committee to investigate the whole incident. The commission was to evaluate the abilities of the Soviet army and to re-examine the performance of armaments and operations against the Russians. Where military equipment was concerned, firepower proved far inferior. Heated debates ensued about the 2 basic alternatives, whether to effect a thoroughgoing reorganization or whether to go only as far as reinforcing current firepower materiel. The second alternative was selected. Lurking in the background of the controversy was the problem of abandoning the principle of hand-to-hand fighting, a tradition of the infantry. The High Command did not awaken to the remarkable progress of material potentials in modern warfare, but instead continued to esteem the superiority of spiritual fighting strength. This attitude could perhaps be traced to the fact that the army did not progress beyond comprehending firepower at the levels of 1904 to 05. It had never received a baptism of fire on the modern scale of World War I. Now the Second World War had just broken out. Military authorities, admiring the brilliant successes of German army operations, began to cherish a desire to learn from German experience rather than from that of the Nomonhan incident. This desire crystallized into the dispatch of the Yamashita military inspection team to Germany. The high-ranking officers of the Army General Staff and Kwantung Army Headquarters were called to account for the defeat of Nomonhan. In Tokyo, Tetsuzo Nakajima, Deputy Chief of the General Staff, and Gun Hashimoto, Chief of the First Bureau, were ordered to retire from service. In Helsinki, enforced retirements were imposed upon Kenkichi Ueda, the commander of the Kwantung Army, and his Chief of Staff, Rensuke Isogaya. Despite the shake-up, most of the staff officers in the first section, operations, at Kwantung Army Headquarters officers who were alleged to have been really responsible and to have exerted major influence during the Nomonhan incident were merely transferred to sinecures. Moreover, the transferred officers afterwards obtained important posts within the High Command unnoticed. Some of them indeed ended up by occupying key positions within the Operations Bureau at Imperial General Headquarters itself. The shake-up, in other words, was merely for the sake of appearances. Such were the workings of military personnel administration. Commensurate rewards or punishments were not dealt out fairly within the army. When advocates of strongly positive views made mistakes, the authorities in personnel administration overlooked them. Even if punishments were meted out, it was only for form's sake. On the other hand, proponents of a prudent approach to things were apt to be treated like cowards, and were often held to strict account when they erred. This system of administering military personnel affairs fostered a foolhardiness which, in turn, was to provoke successive disturbances which were quite uncalled for. It is generally acknowledged by those who held contemporaneous high command posts that the officers responsible for the Nomonhan debacle became strong advocates for launching the Pacific War. The experience of border conflicts and the ongoing China incident led to significant changes in diplomatic strategy and alliance formation. The title of the German Anti-Comintern Pact, November 1936, seemed to indicate the apparent objectives behind its conclusion, but there were hidden military aims. In the event that the nation or Germany had to fight the USSR, neither country was to do anything that could lighten the Soviet burden or relieve the Russians of fear for their rear. Russia had been unencumbered, in these respects, during both the War of 1904 to 05 and World War I. This was the major import of Article 1 of the secret protocol attached to the pact. The Anti-Comintern Agreement thus possessed inherent possibilities of developing into a full-fledged military alliance. On September 27, 1940, a Tripartite Pact was concluded in Berlin between the nation, Germany, and Italy. The alliance was an extension of the Anti-Comintern Pact and represented the concrete implementation of decisions adopted at the IGHQ Government Liaison Conference of July 27, 1940. One article in the Outline of Policy for Coping with Developments in the World Situation, formulated by that liaison conference, had called for the prompt strengthening of ties between the Axis powers. By concluding the tripartite alliance, the nation intended to strengthen her diplomatic position and thus facilitate an early settlement of the China incident. Germany also expected that the alliance would restrain America from participating in the Second World War. There was hope, moreover, that cooperation between the nation and Germany would increase if the Soviet Union could be brought to align itself with the tripartite powers. Before its conclusion, the Tripartite Pact had actually given rise to heated controversies within the government. The Army and the Navy, in particular, held diametrically opposed views. The First Service earnestly desired consummation of an alliance, whereas the latter continued to oppose it for fear of provoking hostilities with the United States and Great Britain. The Navy eventually acceded to the Army's desire, however, because naval opinions were heeded by the Army to some degree. Specifically, the first draft of the accord had been revised. The nation was no longer automatically committed to participation in an Axis war, but could instead decide her course of action independently. Foreign Minister Matsuoka declared that he would do his best to adjust diplomatic relations with the United States and with the Soviet Union. The army, in addition, assented to the Navy's demands concerning war preparations, allocation of materials, etc. Underlying the conclusion of the Tripartite Pact lurked a fear of missing the bus on the part of the High Command, which was dazzled by the brilliant military successes of the German army at the outset of World War II. An atmosphere of great worry prevailed lest the nation lose her chance if she maintained a cautious policy, with her hands in her pockets, while Germany was stripping the world of its choice treasures. Within the High Command, the feeling rapidly gained sway that the nation should derive great advantage from the Tripartite Pact by carving out her own sphere of influence in East Asia. Concurrently with the manifestation of these mounting sentiments inside army circles, the Military Personnel Administration began to manifest some strange symptoms. High-ranking officers who had once studied in the United States or in Great Britain and had intimate knowledge of actual conditions in those countries now began to disappear from the High Command. Especially in the case of the War Ministry and the General Staff, only 4 or 5 officers who had studied in the United States or England remained in posts above the level of section chief. The key positions were occupied by officers who had been sent to Germany to study. Such personnel policies by the military administration authorities resulted in an intensification of pro-German tendencies and of disdain for the United States and Great Britain. In the end, these policies proved to be a force which drove the nation into the Pacific War. With the conclusion of the Tripartite Alliance, the army renewed its efforts to solve the China incident. To seek to do so through German cooperation was all a great illusion, however. In the eyes of everyone, the incident appeared to be a failure by then. But influenced by Hitler's estimate of the world situation, the military believed it possible to separate America from Great Britain and made light of any view that the two democracies would unite against the Axis powers. It was expected that the United States would forsake England once the latter was brought to its knees, a distinct possibility, since Britain was already old and infirm. After the consummation of the Tripartite Alliance, the nation therefore forced Great Britain and France to seal off the aid to Chiang routes via Indochina, Hong Kong and Burma. Taking advantage of the weakness of the British and French armies in Europe, the army proceeded to advance into northern Indochina. It is well known, however, that this drive strongly incited the American authorities to greater vigilance against the nation. The changing international situation and ongoing military commitments necessitated fundamental reassessments of strategic planning and resource allocation. We have already seen how troop strength reserved for hypothetical anti-Soviet operations had to be committed to China after the Suchow offensive of May 1938. By 1939, opinion was mounting within certain army circles that the existing plan of operations against the USSR should be revised temporarily along defensive lines. According to this view, the China incident should be settled as soon as possible by all-out concentration of military force. This meant that powerful elements of the Kwantung Army would have to be diverted to Chinese battlefields. The General Staff's First Bureau, Operations, nevertheless paid no heed to these opinions. As before, it adhered to the policy of offensive operations in the event of war with the Soviet Union. In the operations plan drawn up in 1939, the axes of Kwantung Army offensive operations were altered to embrace offensives launched simultaneously eastward and northward from the Heiho district. On April 13, 1941, the nation concluded a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union. Prior to this treaty, Great Britain and France had withdrawn their troops from China with the outbreak of the Second World War in order to strengthen the defensive posture of the home countries. This had left only 2 powers confronting the nation in China, namely the Soviet Union and the United States, but after the conclusion of the Russo Neutrality Pact, the situation was further simplified. Only the United States now confronted the nation. IGHQ seized this opportunity to draft a plan of operations against Chongqing from 2 directions along the Yangtze River and from the Xi'an area. Several picked divisions from the Kwantung Army were to be diverted to the China front, but the Russo-German War broke out just when preparations were being made for the offensive in China. The outbreak of the Russo-German War in June 1941 created both opportunities and dilemmas that would prove decisive in the nation's path toward the Pacific War. At the Imperial Conference held on July 2, 1941, the following policies were decided upon. 1. Do not intervene in the Russo-German War. 2. Proceed with prudent diplomatic negotiations while consolidating secret preparations against the USSR. 3. If the Russo-German War turns out favorably for the nation, settle the northern problem by force and maintain stability in the north. Because of these decisions, which resulted from the outbreak of the Russo-German War, the chunking operation had to be suspended. The Army High Command had traditionally strong tendencies of watchfulness toward the Soviet Union. There thus arose criticism that the settlement of the China incident by force had been incomplete because the nation was nailed down by Russia. At the root of the High Command's attitude toward the USSR lay the following considerations. Conflict between the nation and Russia was just a matter of time. It was taboo for the nation to demonstrate weakness toward the Soviet Union. Armaments were therefore the only means of stabilizing matters with Russia. After the Imperial Conference of July 2, IGHQ implemented the new policy toward the Soviet Union by commencing the large-scale reinforcement of the Kwantung Army. To keep the true reasons secret, the build-up was called the Special Maneuvers of the Kwantung Army, or Kantokuen for short. The 400,000 troops in the Kwantung Army were suddenly stepped up to over 700,000, and some billion yen in military funds were expended only upon Kantokuen. The special maneuvers consisted of preparations for the use of force against the Soviet Union, based upon the outlook that the Russo-German War might take a rapidly favorable turn for Germany. Kantokuen, indeed, can be compared to running toward a bus stop in order not to miss the bus. In the event that force was used against the USSR, the operational plan of 1939 was scheduled to go into effect, whereby simultaneous offensives were to be mounted toward the north and the east from Manchuria. Although the Kwantung Army had been reinforced, the Russo-German war about which the army had held such great expectations was not turning out favorably for Germany, despite Hitler's boasts. A serious problem consequently demanded resolution. How could the beefed-up Kwantung Army pull through the rigorous cold of a Manchurian winter? Meanwhile, interest in the southern regions was mounting. In the Navy, some advocated the necessity for driving southward and attempted to restrain the Army's desire to strike north. Previously, on June 12, 1941, the IGHQ Government Liaison Conference had already decided to enter southern French Indochina. At the time, the actual move had been postponed because of Foreign Minister Matsuoka's cautious arguments. The matter was reaffirmed, however, at the Imperial Conference of July 2, after the sudden outbreak of the Russo-German War. On the 28th and 29th of the month, the advance into South French Indochina was effected. At another Imperial Conference, on September 6, the commencement of preparations for the southern operations was determined. As a consequence of this decision, the critical winter problem facing the Kwantung Army was solved after September. Part of the forces in Manchuria were to be diverted to the southern operations. Thus, the so-called special maneuvers did play an important role in killing two birds with one stone. Military preparations against both the USSR and the southern areas had been stepped up and reinforced. The decision to move into southern French Indochina represented a crucial turning point that would set the nation on an irreversible collision course with the United States. We have already seen the circumstances which led to the nation's entry into South Indochina. In general, the Imperial Conference of July 2, 1941, merely reaffirmed most of the existing plans regarding the southern regions with one new and major exception. It was now expressly resolved that the nation should not avoid war with the United States and Great Britain in carrying out her policies toward the southern regions. Concerning this vital clause, the Army High Command planner explained that the Army itself was determined never to wage war against the United States and England, but that they were obliged to use such terminology because of the need to steer public opinion. The Chief and Deputy Chief of the General Staff also stated that prime consideration was being devoted to the settlement of the China incident, and that the Army had not decided to consider fighting the Americans or even the British. Those who were concerned with operations interpreted the clause to signify no intention of launching a war, but instead to suggest that readiness was required. Hostilities, in this view, would not be avoided with the United States and Great Britain if they used force to obstruct the nation's intentions of realizing her established policies toward Thailand and French Indochina through all possible diplomatic means. Interpretations of this critically important national policy were bound to vary. Even high command circles lacked a unanimous understanding of the policy. The confusion had been caused by the intention of effecting a compromise between the differing views. Rhetorical flourishes lent themselves to various interpretations, without resolving the divergencies by exhaustive discussion. Similar cases were frequent throughout the Pacific War. Diverse interpretations were often put forth concerning important plans due to a lack of clarity in views and of resultant plainness in expression. Vital documents thus often proved to be inexplicable as to the meaning of words and phrases in cases where the original author was transferred to some other post. On July 26, 1941, 5 days after the formation of the Third Conoye Cabineta Mutual Defense Agreement was concluded between the nation and the French Indochina authorities. Two things rendered the arrangement imperative. First, there was the situation in Thailand. That country was then outwardly manifesting goodwill toward the nation but was assiduously and secretly maintaining friendly relations with the United States and England. The nation was aiming to step up operations intended to seal off the aid to Chiang routes from behind Chungking via Indochina, Thailand and Burma, and to force Thailand to maintain a benevolent neutrality. These objectives were to be achieved by moving troops into South Indochina. Secondly, the nation was obliged passively to take steps to cope with the ring encircling Herth, ABCD, powers of America, Britain, China, and the Dutch politically, economically, and militarily. From the standpoint of food supply, the pressure to be applied upon Thailand by the nation was especially important. For if the United States and Great Britain exerted strong pressure upon Thailand and French Indochina, especially the southern portion, the two Southeastern Asian countries were bound to stay on the side of the Western powers. The settlement of the China incident would then prove impossible. The nation, endangered, would have to back down completely from her position. The major objective which lay behind the entry into South Indochina, thus, was the settlement of the China incident, but, simultaneously, the nation was pursuing a policy of offense and defense against the United States and England. It cannot be denied, however, that behind the attitude there lurked the idea that South Indochina might serve as a foothold from which the nation could push on to the south. The entry into southern French Indochina produced international repercussions. Relations between the nation and the United States in particular took a sudden turn for the worse. Soon after giving notice that in view of the situation no further basis remained for carrying on with the American parleys, the United States froze assets and then proceeded to embargo aviation fuel on August 1, 1941. Governing circles in neither the Army nor the Navy had undertaken preliminary studies of the international consequences attending the move into South Indochina. Yet peace is indivisible and cannot exist in only a limited part of the world. Sensibilities were too dull to grasp the fact that action against southern Indochina concerned not only the nation and the French, but was a matter of global policy affecting the Axis powers and their enemies. The move was therefore bound to exert great influence upon the whole world. As a result of the Indochina operation and the consequently complete deadlock in the talks with the United States, the nation proceeded to carry out the decisions reached at the Imperial Conference of September 6. She now accelerated full-scale preparations for war with the United States and with Great Britain, setting the target date for their completion at the end of October 1941. As the nation moved closer to war, military leaders conducted comprehensive assessments of both enemy capabilities and domestic preparedness for the coming conflict. Toward autumn of 1941, the Army High Command formulated certain estimates of the international situation. Concerning the outcome of the Russo-German War, the view prevailed that things would turn out favorably for Germany. Although the lightning war which Hitler had planned, of 6 weeks' duration, had not materialized, the Soviet army had suffered undeniably critical losses at the outset of hostilities. The Germans still possessed so much military power that they could yet crush the Soviet army. Great expectations were therefore held concerning the Germans' summer offensive slated to commence in 1942. The Russians had transferred several divisions from the Far East to the European battlefields, but the USSR would never leave Siberia defenseless even if the war with Germany turned out badly for her. It was thought to be almost beyond the realm of possibility for the Soviet Union to participate in a war between the nation and the United States, of her own accord, thereby having to wage two front operations. Chinese nationalist ground force strength was estimated at 3 million men, supported by the domestic economy of the hinterland and by external assistance from the Americans and the British. The High Command judged that the nationalist regime could be brought to its knees by means of two operations, cutting off the aid to Chiang routes and driving upon Chongqing. The army had the impression that Great Britain was already senile, for she had often appeased the nation during the China incident. It was considered inevitable that German submarine operations, plus landings on the British Isles themselves, could bring down the English. There may have been other contributing factors. Thus, the governing circles in the Army High Command were, at the time, blinded by Germany's brilliant operations. They ignored America's assistance to the British and also lacked experts on England. The military had a strong tendency to disbelieve and to treat as astronomical official United States government data indicating the rate of production of American industry. In addition, they made light of America's spiritual fiber. The majority believed that the United States would find it difficult to instill a martial spirit throughout the nation as a whole. After all, isolationism was rampant there, and most of the advocates were influential figures. The Army High Command's outlook upon the international situation was therefore remarkable for its tendency to overestimate Germany and to underestimate other countries. The underlying cause for misjudging the United States and Great Britain in particular can be traced back to both personnel administration and to the educational system in the military preparatory schools. We have previously touched upon aspects of personnel affairs, where high-ranking officers who had studied in either England or America could not attain positions of the highest command, simply because it was assumed that they were inevitably pro-American, pro-British, or defeatist. This outlook became even more pronounced after the conclusion of the Tripartite Pact. Insofar as education in the military prep schools was concerned, foreign language study posed a number of problems. German, French, and Russian were the only foreign languages which used to be taught there. On the other hand, English and Chinese were special subjects to be pursued only by those who entered the military academy from high school. Nevertheless, most of the officers who were sent abroad to study military affairs were products of the military prep schools, not of the high schools. These officers were selected on the basis of their class standings at the time of their graduation from the military academy. As a consequence, most officers who had gone to study in Germany, France, or Russia obtained important posts upon their return home, a prospect open to only a few of those who had studied in the United States or in England. Such a system resulted in but meagre comprehension of America and Great Britain in army circles. Toward the winter of 1940, the Army High Command asked the War Ministry's Economic Mobilization Bureau to investigate and predict possible developments in the power position of the nation. Two hypothetical assumptions were postulated. A. The nation launches a war against the United States and Great Britain in the spring of 1941. Or B. The nation completely avoids hostilities. The major conclusions are summarized as follows. Assumption A. There is hope of making up shortages of iron ore and light metals in the future, if shipping losses are not severe. Rare and non-ferrous metals, however, would become drastically insufficient in the third year after the commencement of war, because further acquisitions would be unpromising. Liquid fuel would also end up in the same critical status. If, on the other hand, shipping losses proved great, there was a strong possibility that entire industries would be paralyzed because of diminution in the transportation of coal supplies. Assumption B. If the United States and Great Britain enforced a cut-off in economic relations, the nation's natural resources would be remarkably diminished. The shortage of liquid fuel, in particular, would deal a fatal blow to the nation. Afterwards, when U.S. relations were becoming serious as a consequence of the Army's entry into South French Indochina, July 1941, the Army High Command again turned to the Economic Mobilization Bureau of the War Ministry. Posing a hypothetical date of November 1st for the eventuality of hostilities against America and England, the Army asked the Bureau to re-examine the national power position. The conclusion was forthcoming. Under the circumstances, the future held no hope for the nation, even if she waited with prudence and circumspection. Implicit confidence could not be placed in the economic and industrial situation of the nation beyond 2 years after the commencement of hostilities, even if the nation resolved to initiate matters herself. If, despite a rupture in economic relations with the United States and England, the nation were to carry on with the China incident, her stores of liquid fuel would drop in 2 years to 800,000 kiloliters of aviation fuel and 2,300,000 kiloliters of heavy oil. And if, with her remaining stocks of fuel, the nation launched into intensive warfare, her army and navy could only hope to wage aerial operations for about a year. At sea, she could only fight decisive battle operations for about half a year. This outlook underlay the military leader's advocacy of the view, characterized as the nation's gradual decline. It is well known that this view became a justification used by those who proposed launching war. The number of Army ground divisions increased annually as follows, figures as of end of year in each case. 1937 24 divisions, 1938 34, 1939 39, 1940 50, 1941 51. From about 1937, tank units began to be stepped up. A mechanized headquarters was finally established in April 1941. Meanwhile, in the light of the experience gained at Nomonhan, there was some sentiment to the effect that the first objective of the Armored Unit Consolidation Program should be 10 completely equipped tank divisions. In fact, however, no armored divisions had been activated by the time the Pacific War broke out. In 1937, the Army had drawn up a plan to reinforce Air Force strength from 54 to 142 squadrons in one fell swoop between 1938 and 1942. The plan was changed in 1939, with an envisaged increase to 162 squadrons by the end of 1943. The annual number of Air Force squadrons was in reality increased as follows, data as of end of year in each instance. 1938 70 squadrons, 1939 94, 1940 100, 16 1941 133. In connection with military armaments, the Army was troubled about the expansion of war industrial potential. The War Ministry, in the spring of 1937, had already drafted 5-year plans to enlarge the munitions industry and other important industrial spheres of the economy. The ministry did its best to accomplish the goals which were set. With the advent of the China incident, things had turned out so well that, toward the end of 1940, levels of production were reached that were sufficient to meet the full requirements of the China theater, plus the extra power needed to arm against the Soviet Union. Stocks of shells, in particular, were greatly increased. Just before the commencement of the Pacific War, the nation had developed a productive capacity which enabled her to manufacture about 3,500 military aircraft and 1,200 tanks per year. From the end of 1940 until June 1941, Lieutenant General Yamashita's military inspection team was visiting Germany and Italy. The gist of the general's report follows. 1. Military material programs should stress air power and mechanization for the Army. Air strength must be especially built up, on a priority basis qualitatively and quantitatively. 2. Emphasis in ground armaments should be accorded speed and armor, built around a nucleus of medium tanks. In the case of other combat arms, mechanization and advanced technology must also be exploited to the fullest. 3. Paratroop units should be organized as soon as possible, and practical applications must be examined. 4. Omitted. 5. In view of the out-of-date equipment of the Army, it is concluded that the last thing the nation should contemplate is the initiation of war against either the United States, Great Britain, or the Soviet Union. The nation should accordingly exercise patience in avoiding the outbreak of war, meanwhile concentrating all of her strength upon the modernization of her military materiel. In accordance with the Yamashita report, the military authorities decided to lay greater strength upon air power thereafter. Steps were taken to beef up potentials, to organize paratroop forces, and to study methods of employment. Contrary to the conclusions reached by the Yamashita mission, however, the measures introduced turned out to be preliminary preparations, useful in case a war with America broke out. By their very nature, armaments must be perfectly adapted to combat methods and to battlefield topography. The optimum application of military force cannot otherwise be manifested. There was thus a strong requirement that operations and armaments be linked together. In the army, however, military materiel was geared to hypothetical mobile operations against the Soviet Union. This implied fighting on the continent, in severe cold, amidst sparse population, and with inconvenient transportation facilities. Operations of such a type were characterized by light weapons, large-scale logistical systems, and a plethora of horses. If, on the other hand, ground operations are to be launched far across the seas, it is imperative to organize special units, abundantly endowed with fire power and mobility, but able to operate with minimal supply requirements. Foreign colonial powers had such units, but the army did not, and had not yet studied the matter. With the deterioration of the situation in the southern regions, however, the nation undertook a hasty and temporary reorganization of her cold-weather troops and dispatched them to tropical littorals. Perhaps it was all unavoidable, but because the wrong measures were undertaken at the time, units sent far overseas were blamed for their poor performance after the Pacific War broke out, despite their heavy strength in personnel and their overabundance of horses. Imperial General Headquarters, the General Staff, with its background of insistence upon the independence of the prerogative of Supreme Command, possessed a strong basis for preeminence. Within IGHQ itself, General Sugiyama, the Army Chief of Staff, was practically a robot. Real power lay with the First Bureau, Operations. This bureau, with its own dictum concerning the secrecy of Supreme Command, adopted ultra-secret policies and acted like a law unto itself, with utter self-satisfaction. It is the common opinion of those who served on the IGHQ staffs when the Pacific War broke out that the driving force to commence hostilities stemmed from the First Bureau advocates. At the War Ministry, on the other hand, it was the Bureau of Military Affairs which played the most active role. The ministry was engaged in matters related to actualities, and hence was more concrete and practical in its ways of working and thinking than was IGHQ. In the War Ministry bureaus concerned with materiel and armament, there prevailed an atmosphere of special anxiety concerning the initiation of hostilities. Tojo, the Minister of War, tried to maintain control over the army. In this respect, he has the reputation for having been the most able war minister, and with the best results, since the outbreak of the Manchurian incident in 1931. Prior to the Pacific War, the quarrels between cliques, the Kodoha and the Toseiha, discussed earlier, were replaced by a new tendency which attracted remarkable attention: friendships among classmates of the military academy, which exerted tremendous influence upon official business. Within the army, a special notice was drawn to the proposals and movements of 25th class graduates, such as Shinichi Tanaka, Chief of the Operations Bureau, Akira Muto, Chief of the Military Affairs Bureau, and Kyoji Tominaga, Chief of the Personnel Administration Bureau. The whereabouts of 29th, 34th, and 35th graduation class officers, in particular, also became special topics of Army conversation. After the 226 incident of 1936, Tojo did his best to eliminate the Emperor's distrust of the army. He reported various problems, whether large or small, to the sovereign, and always went through 3 stages of presentation: initial précis, interim report, and definitive project. The views of Prime Minister Konoye and of Tojo clashed head-on. Konoye was planning to bring the parleys with the United States to a successful close by agreeing to the withdrawal of troops from China. Tojo, on the other hand, regarded this course of action as leading to the utter nullification of the nation's continental policy, and he strongly opposed it. The divergence in opinion gathered intensity after October 1941. Tojo spoke of the need to resolve upon war and urged such a policy to the Prime Minister. He told Konoye that it was sometimes necessary for a man to leap from the stage of Kiyomizu. The differences between Tojo and Konoye finally led to the fall of the prince's third cabinet. Tojo, representing the tough elements, was then recommended to head the succeeding government. After the formation of his new government, Tojo ordered the Cabinet Planning Board to re-examine the question of the possible effects upon national power if the United States, Great Britain, and the Netherlands were to cut off their trade with the nation. Tojo asked the board to start from scratch, and especially to ascertain the possibilities of the nation's avoidance of a crisis by stepping up the development of the synthetic petroleum industry. Suzuki, the chief of the Cabinet Planning Board, reported that the whole problem of synthetic fuel had been examined and that it was assumed that 5,200,000 tons of petroleum would be required annually. Tojo was told that rapid achievement of self-sufficiency could not be expected. Even if intensive efforts were made, it would still take at least 7 years before the desired results could be obtained. In her conversations with the United States, the nation was prepared for either war or peace. While pursuing a policy of negotiation, the nation simultaneously proceeded with operational preparations. On November 26, 1941, the United States submitted 3 proposals. 1. Repudiate the Nanking puppet government. 2. Evacuate China and Indochina. And 3. Repudiate the Tripartite Alliance. The government decided that these terms were inadmissible. At the Imperial Conference of December 1st, it was determined to open war against the United States, Great Britain, and the Netherlands. Although the government thus decided upon hostilities, it possessed no feasible plans for bringing the war to an end. Of course, there was a so-called plan for accelerating the termination of war against the United States, England, and the Netherlands, decided upon at the Liaison Conference of November 15, 1941. But this document merely summed up the nation's one-sided wishful thinking. The nation had at last leaped from Kiyomizu with her eyes closed.